18 months ago, the front cover of The Spectator Australia predicted that leftist vandals would soon be coming after Vincent van Gogh's magnificent sunflowers as part of their cultural cleansing. And sure enough, the other day, it happened. A couple of eco-idiots decided to throw orange soup all over the famous painting on display at London's ultra-woke National Gallery as their way of drawing attention to the, quote, urgent need to tackle climate change. As I pointed out on Outsiders back in August, the National Gallery, which I had the misfortune of visiting, had already devoted their entire summer exhibition to ghastly so-called works of art which purported to also raise awareness about climate change. So I suspect these young eco-activists, or yobs, as the Sun called them, were only doing a more overt version of what the National Gallery themselves were already guilty of: vandalising art in the name of climate justice. Security. Indeed, if you can tell the difference between the vandalised sunflowers after the soup and most of the so-called modern art pieces that were actually exhibited in the National Gallery's climate change exhibition, then you've got a far better eye than I have. Still, not content with defacing works of art, the climate activists, and there are now any number of these organisations, Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, Blockade, all equally hell-bent on grabbing the headlines and grabbing your attention. Well, one of them also this week managed to spray orange muck all over the famous New Scotland Yard sign in London.
We are holding innocent protesters, peaceful protesters, in prison, and all they're doing is standing up to the corrupt government and the corporations. Joshua Smith is in prison, and he's been there for 7 months.
Then there are the vegan activists who have decided the best way to draw attention to what they call plant-based food, is to tip milk all over the floor in supermarkets. Why not?
It is responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions than the oil giants like Exxon, Shell and BP. The top 4 dairy companies are responsible for the majority of methane emissions. We want people protesting on silence.
The point of pouring out milk, apparently, and other dairy products all over the supermarket floor is, as the young lass helpfully explained, to cut down on our methane emissions in order to save the climate, in order to save the planet. I wonder who gets to clean up the mess all over the supermarket floor. Not them, I suspect, probably some long-suffering, underpaid single mum who can probably barely afford to take home a litre of milk to her own kids. But anyway, I digress. Who can forget the young lass acquitted the other day who chained herself to her steering wheel in order to block the Sydney Harbour Tunnel?
There's a really angry person who's coming up to the car who has been threatening me with violence. I'm not sure what's about to happen.
You f***ing everyone stay up, you
Yes, indeed. You might like to think of all those kids as vandals, hooligans, yobbos, yobs, whatever, and be appalled at the wanton destruction of property. You may call them idiots who don't even understand the consequences of their own actions. And of course, you would be right. But these are the rank amateurs, the real vandals. Don't throw soup or milk around the place or lock themselves to steering wheels. The real vandals, well, they are the ones who were in positions of authority who could have counteracted this madness by insisting that the world is not about to come to an end because of fossil fuels, but who chose instead to play along to the climate fantasy for their own motives. The same people who could have demanded that teachers stop terrorising young minds with climate cult activism, but couldn't be bothered fighting the climate wars or the culture wars. The same people who could have stripped the funding from the ABC if they continued pumping climate propaganda dressed up as behind the news into schools and kindergartens, but for a decade chose not to do anything. The same people who could have stopped funding universities that train those very students to be climate change activists, but chose not to. who could and should have explained to every farming community, every tradie, every small business, every mum and dad, and every large corporation that all emissions reductions come at a hefty price and you will pay through the nose for them. But chose instead to stoke the panic around fossil fuels, to pander to the neo-Marxists, even though many of them will tell you in private that climate alarmism is a load of nonsense. The real vandals are the ones who have allowed greedy renewables investors and international hedge fund managers to dictate the policy of this nation against the clear mandate from the people who put them into those positions of authority. They are the real vandals. The simple reality is that there is no difference between passionately believing in climate change and pretending to believe in climate change, or even simply pandering to the belief in climate change. For greed or political expediency or any other motive, the end result is the same. You desecrate the truth, you vandalise the future, like this.
Our plan for net zero by 2050 is the plan that I believe Australians want, because it gets it right. It's been carefully put together. We've listened very carefully to both the concerns and the ambitions. What is important is that I act consistent with the mandate I had from the Australian people. They rejected a 45% target at the last election. They endorsed a meet and beat target of 26 to 28%.
Will you go to the election seeking a new mandate for a new 2030 target? And just on you won't? Okay.
No. By his own admission, Scott Morrison not only betrayed the mandate given to him at the 2019 election, he deliberately avoided seeking a new mandate for a new target at the next election, a double betrayal of every quiet Australian who'd voted for him in the miracle election. That is the vandalism of trust. That is the wanton destruction, not of property, but of our future prosperity. No wonder our kids, many of them well-meaning but simply misguided and badly educated, are frustrated instead of being reassured by our political leaders that the world is not facing an existential crisis. Our leaders have pandered to those very fears and even stoked them. There is no difference, as I keep saying, philosophically, between gluing yourself to the pavement or gluing your country to net zero, between trashing a Van Gogh or trashing a conviction. It's just a matter of scale. But it gets worse, as we learned this week. Here is Barnaby Joyce 12 months ago explaining why the Nationals, under his leadership, had agreed to sign up to Scott Morrison's net zero betrayal. Listen very carefully.
The way I saw it was the Prime Minister was going to Glasgow in any case. He was not beholden to any decision of the Nationals as to whether he went or not. So the Nationals had two choices. We could negotiate a better outcome for regional Australia, or be part of a sort of a thespian outfit, ranting and raving, but having no real effect on any decisions that were made.
A thespian outfit ranting and raving. Nice. That'd be people like me pointing out that net zero is pure insanity. That's how Mr. Joyce viewed those of us who, quite rightly, as we now know, warned that net zero in Europe, the closing of coal mines, the reliance on renewables, not using nuclear, was having disastrous consequences there and elsewhere around the world. Mr. Joyce claimed he was more useful being inside the government tent betraying core principles than outside the tent sticking up for them. He couldn't have been more wrong. He even claimed that he was protecting Australia from potential methane cuts, which will cripple our agriculture and farming communities.
The United States and EU has been pushing other nations to slash methane emissions by 30% by 2030. It appears Australia, though, will hold out on that. Nationals leader Barnaby Joyce this morning insists that is because he put that in part of the agreement he negotiated with the Prime Minister.
The Nats were absolutely implicit that no deal would go forward that we would support unless it was absolutely categorically ruled out, and we got that.
Well, That worked out well, didn't it? This week, Albo and Bowen started laying the groundwork for precisely that, a 30% cut in methane, which will rip the guts out of regional Australia. But this is what happens when you sacrifice core convictions for a fistful of silver baubles. There's no going back afterwards. The joke is, as we learned this week, the bribes themselves can be snatched away as easily as they are doled out. Anthony Albanese and his government have now said that they will reverse what they claim were the bribes offered to the Nats to agree to net zero. According to the Australian newspaper, Labor will target more than $10 billion in funding for regional projects promised, quote, as bargaining chips to pay off the Nationals to support Scott Morrison's pledge of net zero emissions. The Albanese government is also likely to gut the $7.1 billion Energy Security and Regional Development Plan, which was a key win for the Nationals in the net zero negotiations. You lost everything, folks, everything. You're out of government and you got diddly squat for selling out your principles and, more importantly, selling out your farmers. The energy providers have promised electricity bills will go up by at least 35% next year. On top of that, Labor has now pledged, quote, to methane cuts of 30%, which will decimate our farmers. Great work, bedwetters. Thank you. Perhaps you might now care to look at Japan or Europe, where they are frantically switching back to coal and nuclear. Even the German Greens and Greta Thunberg are saying so. And the United States, where Biden is running around the Middle East with a begging bowl, pleading for more gas, to see the utter stupidity of what you deliberately threw away. You threw it all away, all for this sort of nonsense.
It's 130 pages that goes through detail by detail every step of what we're going to do. It's a whole of economy plan which looks at how we're going to decarbonise different sectors, utilising technology and innovation. And frankly, it's consistent with what every other country is doing in terms of how they're trying to decarbonise too. And so it's how we take Australia forward in an Australian way to build the future growth and opportunity of our nation, while also making sure we save the climate and make a buck along the way too.
Well, the PM says the plan is based on existing policies. So can you point to a single measure announced today that we haven't actually seen before?
Yeah, there's a very specific focus on low cost.
It was total twaddle, Tim. Every other country is not desperately trying to decarbonise. They are, in fact, desperately trying to source cheap energy because they did decarbonise. So where are they now? Where are you now, you geniuses who gave us there will be no methane cuts under a government I am part of? You geniuses who gave us the uniquely Australian plan? You geniuses who told us innovation would lead us to making a fortune out of totally unproven new technologies, like the shonkiest carpetbaggers and snake oil salesmen from the American Depression era. You're out of government, and you're out of power. By abandoning your principles, you abandoned the rest of us to a hardcore, quasi-socialist left-wing government that you now have no idea how to stand up to. That's what happens, folks, when you sell your soul. Speaking of which, Scott Morrison is now trying to make a quid on the speaker circuit, where he touts himself as a, quote, globalisation mastermind with, quote, boundless influence around the world. I'm sure Klaus Schwab must be impressed. Perhaps Scotty can get a global marketing gig at next year's World Economic Forum in Davos. He could come up with a nifty slogan. What the bloody hell happened to my electricity bill? You were comprehensively betrayed, Australia, particularly regional Australia. The coalition must now turn the tide and do it fast, because this country will not survive 2 terms of Labor. We'll be lucky to survive 1. Here's 3 simple tips, Mr. Dutton. Abandon net zero tomorrow. Oppose the voice on principle. And thirdly, if you see Simon Birmingham walking towards you, stick your finger in your ears and go la 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 at the top of your lungs until he's safely out of the way. That should do it.